Imagine waking up tomorrow and every book on Earth has vanished. Every street sign, every text message, every scrap of paper with a word on it. No internet, because the internet is built entirely out of writing. No laws you can look up, no recipes you can follow. No letters from anyone who has ever loved you. Just silence and memory, and whatever the person next to you happens to remember before they forget it too. That was reality for humans for almost the entirety of our existence. Homo sapiens has been walking this planet for roughly 300,000 years. Writing has existed for about 5,000 of them. Do the math, and you will find something startling. For 98% of human history, nothing was ever written down. Not a single word, not a name, not a debt, not a warning, not a story. Everything a civilization knew had to live inside the fragile, temporary, endlessly rewritable space of a human brain. So here is the question that should genuinely unsettle you. How did massive, organized, thriving societies function for so long with absolutely nothing written down? How did people trade goods across hundreds of miles, enforce laws, track debts, pass down entire histories, and coordinate the labor of thousands of workers, all without a single symbol on a single surface? And even more mysterious, what finally broke that silence? What forced a species that had survived for hundreds of thousands of years without writing to suddenly, almost urgently, invent it? The answer is not a single flash of genius. It is not one brilliant person sitting down one day and deciding to invent the alphabet. The real story is slower, stranger, and far more human than that. It begins not with a scholar, but with a shepherd, not with a pen, but with a fistful of clay. Before we get there, we need to understand what the world looked like before writing existed at all. For most of prehistory, human groups were small. A few dozen people, maybe a few hundred. In a group that size, memory is enough. You know who owes you a favor. You know which plants are poisonous because your mother warned you, and her mother warned her. Knowledge moved from mouth to ear, generation after generation, carried entirely by memory and repetition. This was not primitive. It was remarkably sophisticated. Oral traditions could preserve extraordinarily detailed information across centuries. Song, rhythm, poetry, and ritual all served as memory technology long before ink existed. Rhyme made stories easier to recall correctly. Repetition made laws easier to enforce consistently. Elders became living archives, walking libraries whose entire job was to remember correctly and pass the knowledge on without corruption. But oral memory has a weakness, and it is not obvious until a society grows large enough to expose it. Around 12,000 years ago, something enormous began to shift. Humans in parts of the Near East started giving up the nomadic hunting and gathering life that had defined our species for hundreds of thousands of years. They started planting crops, domesticating animals, building permanent settlements instead of following herds and seasons. This is the moment archaeologists call the agricultural revolution, and it changed everything, including how information needed to move. When you live in a small band of 30 people, you do not need a written contract to remember who lent a spear to whom. But when a village grows into a town, and a town grows into a city, and that city is now home to farmers, herders, potters, priests, and administrators, the human memory that worked perfectly well for 30 people starts to break down under the weight of thousands. Suddenly there are questions that memory alone cannot reliably answer. How many sheep does this household actually own? How much grain was stored in the communal granary last season, and how much is left now? Who delivered olive oil to the temple, and how much did they promise, and has that promise been kept? These are not poetic questions. They are administrative ones. And administration, it turns out, may be the true birthplace of writing. This is where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn, and it comes from an archaeologist named Denise Schmont-Besserat. In the 1970s, Schmont-Besserat was studying small clay objects that had been sitting in museum drawers for decades, mostly ignored, labeled vaguely as amulets or game pieces or simply unidentified. These were tiny geometric shapes, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders, found by the thousands across sites in the ancient Near East, some dating back over 9,000 years. She noticed something nobody had connected before. These small clay tokens appeared again and again at sites associated with the earliest farming communities, and their shapes seemed to correspond to specific goods. A cone might represent a small measure of grain, a sphere might represent a larger measure, a cylindrical token might stand for an animal. In other words, these were not decorations. They were an accounting system, a physical, tangible way of representing quantities of real things, invented not by scholars, but by farmers and traders trying to keep track of what belonged to whom. Picture a farmer bringing grain to a communal storehouse. Instead of trusting everyone's memory, he hands over a set of clay tokens that represent exactly how much grain he delivered. The tokens become physical proof, a promise made solid. But here is where it gets even more clever. Eventually, people began sealing these tokens inside hollow clay balls, almost like a tamper-proof envelope made of dried mud, to prevent anyone from adding or removing tokens after the fact. The problem, of course, is obvious the moment you think about it. Once the tokens were sealed inside, nobody could see what was inside without breaking the ball open. So someone came up with an elegant solution. Before sealing the clay ball shut, they pressed the tokens into the wet surface on the outside, leaving an impression, a picture of exactly what was hidden inside. Now anyone could glance at the outside of the ball and know its contents without breaking it. And this is the moment, according to Schmont-Besserat's theory, where something extraordinary quietly happened, almost by accident. If the impression on the outside of the ball told you everything you needed to know, did you even need the tokens inside anymore? The symbol had become more useful than the object it represented. Eventually, people stopped bothering with the hollow clay balls entirely. They simply pressed symbols directly onto flat tablets of wet clay. No tokens required, just marks, representing quantities and goods, dried in the sun to preserve them. This happened in Mesopotamia, in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in cities like Uruk, one of the very first true cities in human history. And by around 3400 to 3200 BC, these simple accounting marks had evolved into something far more powerful, a true writing system known as cuneiform. The name cuneiform comes from the Latin word for wedge, because scribes pressed a cut-reed stylus into soft clay, leaving distinctive wedge-shaped marks. At first, cuneiform was still mostly pictographic, meaning symbols that visually resembled the things they represented. A drawing of a head meant head. A drawing of a bowl of food combined with a head might mean to eat. But pictures alone have a serious limitation. How do you draw an abstract idea like justice, or an emotion like grief, or someone's personal name? Mesopotamian scribes solved this with a breakthrough that ranks among the most important intellectual leaps in human history, the rebus principle. Instead of a symbol always representing an object, it could also represent a sound. This meant symbols could now be combined to spell out words that had nothing to do with the original picture, purely based on how they sounded when spoken aloud. This one shift changed everything. Writing was no longer limited to what could be drawn. It could now capture the full richness of spoken language. Names, abstract concepts, grammar, and complex ideas. Cuneiform eventually expanded to include hundreds of signs and was used to write not just the Sumerian language but later Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian as well, lasting an astonishing 3,000 years before finally fading from use. For a long time, most cuneiform tablets that survived were not epic poetry or royal proclamations. They were remarkably ordinary. Records of grain shipments, lists of workers' wages, receipts for beer, which archaeologists have found was a staple part of Mesopotamian daily rations. Writing, at its origin, was not born from poetry or philosophy. It was born from bookkeeping. But civilizations rarely stay isolated for long, and writing did not stay confined to Mesopotamia. Not far away, along the Nile River, ancient Egypt was developing its own writing system, hieroglyphs, appearing in the archaeological record by roughly 3200 BCE, remarkably close in time to early cuneiform, though most historians consider the two systems to have developed independently, rather than one directly copying the other. Hieroglyphs are strikingly different in appearance from cuneiform's abstract wedges. Egyptian writing remained deeply pictorial for its entire lifespan. Birds, eyes, snakes, and human figures, carved and painted with astonishing detail on temple walls and tomb interiors. But do not let the beauty fool you into thinking hieroglyphs were simple. Like cuneiform, Egyptian writing also combined pictorial signs with sounds, creating a system sophisticated enough to record religious texts, royal achievements, medical knowledge, and detailed administrative records that helped run one of the ancient world's most complex civilizations. For centuries, hieroglyphs were a mystery even to modern scholars. Nobody in the modern world could read them. The knowledge had been lost for well over 1,000 years. That changed in 1799, when French soldiers in Egypt discovered a broken slab of black granite near the town of Rosetta. Inscribed on its surface was the same decree written 3 times, once in hieroglyphs, once in Egyptian Demotic script, and once in ancient Greek, a language scholars could already read. This stone, now known as the Rosetta Stone, became the key that unlocked an entire lost civilization's voice. A French scholar named Jean-François Champollion spent years comparing the 3 texts, painstakingly working out how hieroglyphic symbols corresponded to sounds and words. In 1822, he finally cracked the code. After nearly 2,000 years of silence, Egyptian hieroglyphs could be read again, and an entire lost world of pharaohs, gods, and daily life came flooding back into human understanding. Meanwhile, writing systems were independently taking shape in other parts of the world too. Evidence that the human drive to record information was not confined to one culture or one moment. In China, inscriptions on oracle bones and turtle shells, used for divination and record-keeping, appear by around 1200 BCE, eventually developing into the Chinese script still used in evolved form today, one of the longest continuously used writing systems in human history. In Mesoamerica, the Maya independently developed a complex writing system, combining logographic and phonetic elements, capable of recording history, astronomy, and royal lineages carved into stone monuments that still stand today. Each of these systems shared one thing in common. They were powerful, but they were also difficult. Cuneiform required memorizing hundreds of complex signs. Hieroglyphs required years of dedicated training. Chinese script demanded the same intense discipline. In every one of these early civilizations, literacy was rare, largely reserved for professional scribes, priests, and administrators who trained for years to master systems most ordinary people would never fully learn. That exclusivity was about to be challenged by one of the simplest, most elegant ideas in the entire history of communication. Somewhere around 1900 to 1700 BC, in the Sinai Peninsula and the broader Levant region, a new kind of writing began appearing in scattered inscriptions, often attributed to Semitic-speaking peoples working in Egyptian mining regions. Instead of hundreds of complicated signs representing whole words or syllables, this new system used a small set of symbols, each representing a single consonant sound. This was the ancestor of what scholars broadly call the Proto-Sinaitic script, widely considered one of the earliest steps toward the alphabet. Rather than requiring years of training to memorize hundreds of signs, A person only needed to learn a couple dozen symbols to represent the basic sounds of their spoken language. This idea was refined further by the Phoenicians, a seafaring trading civilization based along the eastern Mediterranean coast, by around 1050 BCE. Their alphabet contained roughly 22 consonant symbols, dramatically simpler than cuneiform or hieroglyphs. And because the Phoenicians were prolific traders, sailing across the Mediterranean to exchange goods with distant cultures, their alphabet did not stay contained to one region. It traveled, port to port, culture to culture, carried along the same trade routes as textiles, timber, and purple dye. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet sometime around the 8th century BC and made a change that would prove enormously significant. Phoenician, like many Semitic languages, primarily wrote consonants, leaving vowel sounds to be inferred by the reader. Greek, however, needed a way to represent vowels clearly, and so Greek scribes repurposed several Phoenician consonant symbols that did not correspond to sounds in their own language, transforming them into the first true vowel letters in history. This may sound like a small technical adjustment, but it was a genuine turning point. With both consonants and vowels represented clearly, the Greek alphabet became remarkably easy to learn compared to earlier writing systems, opening literacy to a far wider portion of the population than ever before. From Greek, the story of the alphabet continues directly into the Latin alphabet used by the Romans, which would eventually spread across Europe through conquest, trade, and later, the printing press, ultimately becoming the very alphabet used to write the words you are reading right now. Writing had gone from an exclusive tool understood only by trained specialists to something that, in principle, almost anyone could learn. But writing by hand still had one enormous limitation. Every single copy of every single text had to be painstakingly reproduced by a human being, one careful stroke at a time. A single book could take a scribe months, sometimes years, to copy by hand. Knowledge could spread, but painfully slowly, and errors crept in with every handwritten copy. That changed around 1440, when a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg developed a printing press using movable metal type in Europe. Individual letters, cast in metal, could be arranged, inked, pressed onto paper, then rearranged and reused for the next page, the next book, the next 1,000 books. For the first time in human history, a single text could be reproduced accurately and rapidly, at a scale previously unimaginable. The effects were seismic. Books that once cost the equivalent of a small farm became affordable to merchants, students, and eventually ordinary households. Literacy rates climbed steadily across Europe over the following centuries. Ideas that once took a lifetime to spread across a continent could now travel in months. Historians widely credit the printing press with accelerating the Renaissance, fueling the Reformation, and laying essential groundwork for the scientific revolution that followed, simply because knowledge could finally move faster than any single human memory could carry it. From there, the story accelerates with startling speed. Handwritten letters gave way to mass-printed newspapers. Newspapers gave way to typewriters, standardizing written communication in offices and homes around the world. In the 20th century, the invention of computers introduced digital text, words no longer bound to physical paper at all, but stored as electronic signals capable of being copied infinitely, instantly, and almost without cost. Then came the internet, connecting billions of these digital words into a single, sprawling, interconnected library larger than anything the scribes of ancient Uruk could possibly have imagined. And then came the smartphone in your pocket right now. Quite possibly the device you are using to watch this very sentence, carrying more written information within it than every clay tablet, papyrus scroll, and printed book from the ancient world combined. Every text message you have ever sent, every search you have ever typed, every caption beneath every photo, all of it descends, in an unbroken chain, from a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia pressing a small clay token into wet mud to prove how much grain he had delivered to a communal storehouse 9,000 years ago. Think about what that really means. The instinct behind writing was never really about art, or literature, or self-expression, though it would eventually become all of those things and more. At its true origin, writing was born from something far more practical and deeply human, the need to be trusted, to prove a promise was kept, to make sure memory did not fail when the stakes were too high to risk forgetting. And that is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. Writing did not arrive as a single miraculous invention handed down from a genius. It emerged gradually, out of necessity, shaped by farmers, traders, and administrators simply trying to solve an urgent, practical problem. Small clay shapes became sealed tokens. Sealed tokens became pressed symbols. Pressed symbols became pictographs. Pictographs became sounds. Sounds became letters. And letters, refined and simplified again and again across thousands of years and dozens of civilizations, eventually became the words now appearing on the screen in front of you. Without this slow, accumulated invention, none of what defines modern civilization could exist. No preserved history, because there would be nothing to preserve it accurately across generations beyond fading memory. No science, because no researcher could build on the precise recorded discoveries of those who came before them. No law, because no rule could be enforced consistently without a fixed, shared record everyone could return to. No literature, no shared knowledge passed reliably across centuries, none of the vast accumulated human inheritance you rely on every single day without ever thinking twice about it. Writing is so woven into daily life now that it feels invisible, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. But it was not always here. It was built, slowly, by ordinary people solving ordinary problems. One small clay token, one carved symbol, one simplified letter at a time. The next time you send a message, jot down a note, or simply read a single word without even thinking about the act of reading itself, remember what that quiet, effortless moment actually represents. It is the end result of 9,000 years of human ingenuity, passed hand to hand, mind to mind, civilization to civilization, until it finally reached you. Somewhere, a farmer once pressed a small clay cone into soft, wet mud, simply hoping to prove that his grain had truly been delivered. He could never have imagined that this small act of trust would one day become every book ever written, every law ever recorded, and every word you have ever read.